Hello and welcome to this webinar on self-regulation. My name is Margie Brickley and I am a consultant with Montclair State University. I may even know some of you from our work together in keeping babies and children in mind. In my other job, I work with new teachers, and this topic comes up a lot for them as they try to understand infants, toddlers, child development, and how we are as professionals working with young children. So let's get started. Okay, so this webinar is being presented under the Social Emotional Formation Initiative, otherwise known as CEFI, by the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health in the College of Education and Human Services at Montclair State University. Funding was provided by the New Jersey Department of Human Services, the Division of Family Development, in support of Grow New Jersey Kids. Use of or reproduction of this material is prohibited without express permission from the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health and the New Jersey Department of Human Services, Division of Family Development. How lucky all of us are in New Jersey that we have Dr. Jerry Costa and a host of other colleagues, including Lori Sullivan and Adam DeBella, who are with me today, to lead us in continuing to develop our understanding of social emotional development. I have to say, as somebody who works in New York, that other states are really jealous of the work we're doing and that the state has been so supportive of this effort. Your attendance for this webinar will be entered into the PING system in a timely manner for participants who stay the length of the webinar, and a certificate of attendance will be available in the GoToWebinar menu handout tab for participants to download at the end of the webinar, and a certificate will also be emailed to you as well. So for this webinar, you will get 1.5 hours towards your New Jersey Association for Infant Mental Health Competencies in the Theoretical Foundations Knowledge Area, Infant, Very Young Children, Child Development, and Behavior. I would encourage all of you to join the New Jersey Association for Infant Mental Health and become endorsed. It really raises the level of professionalism in our field. So here are today's learning objectives. Participants will be able to identify the developmental components of self-regulation. Participants will deconstruct the environmental factors contributing to self-regulation. And participants will create an action plan for helping a child co-regulate and self-regulate. So let's dive in. These are some fancy sounding objectives, but what we will be doing today is learning about what self-regulation is, what makes it difficult for children to self-regulate, and how we as professionals can help with that co-regulation. During this webinar, you'll have opportunities to type a response to a question or comment in the question section of your control panel. This way we can hear from you about your experiences and challenges and have a little bit of a dialogue. So we all know what it feels like and what it looks like when we meet a child right where he is developmentally. We choose the right materials, we have the right space set up for the activity, we have the time to focus with that child on the experience. Let's think about a time where that happened for us. And just in your mind, if you can picture a time when you met a child just where they were developmentally and things went really well and you saw the little gains that the child was making. These are the joyful moments of working with young children, right? But sometimes, all right, a lot of the time, maybe we have a lot of other experiences during a day. Maybe there are 3 hungry babies crying at the same time. Maybe there are some toddlers who are really working hard on learning about mine. And that often looks like grabbing and pushing. And maybe there's even a substitute teacher in the room who none of the children would allow to change their diapers. Which leads us to our next question and our first chance for you to actively participate in the webinar. Here's our reflective question. In the question section on your control panel, you can type your answer to the question. The question is, How do you calm yourself after a long day at work? So I'll wait while people get a chance to type their responses, and I'll read out some of them as they come up. I won't be able to read all of them because there are a lot of you today, but here comes some. All right. Okay, so here's some people are saying, put my feet up, sit on the couch and watch a favorite show, take a walk, go to the gym, watch something funny on TV, talk to my family. I'm only reading the ones that are rated for adults, or all audiences. A little bit of wine, hot bath, lots of exercise, reading. Great. These are some great answers. Okay, so prayer is one of them. Dancing, meditation, listening to music, talking to friends. So these are some of the ways that people really calm themselves down after one of those long days at work when things are not going. Maybe you only have a few moments that you really hit on with children. So notice that all of you came up with calming strategies. You didn't come up with a list of ways that you control yourself. Nobody said that you put yourself in timeout, which may actually be a better idea for adults than for children. Nobody said I count to 10. There's a big difference between self-regulation and self-control. And Dr. Stuart Shanker, who has a self-regulation blog and website that you'll see in the reference section, makes an important point. As people working with children and adults, it's important for us to think of our job as having a calming effect and teaching calming strategies, rather than trying to control the behavior of children. And if any of you have tried to control another person, you know that it's quite frustrating and doesn't really work. And so part of our work with very young children is to help them learn these calming strategies for themselves. And as you can see from your variety of responses, not the same things are going to work for all people. And so for some of you, taking a nap was a really good strategy. For other people, you needed something that was much more of a distraction, like watching TV or doing something active. So where does self-regulation begin? This is an important question, and also an opportunity for me to share a picture of my newborn nephew. It all begins where we learn to regulate our behavior. Surprisingly, the answer can be found in the adults. Before children can self-regulate, they have to co-regulate. They need to learn to calm and regulate through their relationships with caring adults who hold them close so that they can feel our hearts beating, who use a soft voice and say the same things over and over again. And this is really important. The more we establish rituals with children, the easier it will be for them to regulate. So we often instinctively do and say the same thing with a baby or a toddler. We hold them in a position that they like, and we say things like, I've got you, it's okay, Mama's here. We sing them the same songs. We play the same little games while changing their diapers. And these all lead to a predictable and consistent world that helps children become regulated. So when we think about co-regulating with children, what do very young children need? Well, they need for us to be trustworthy, be consistent, be regulated ourselves, and be calm. And when you think about the scene I described before, with some crying babies who are hungry, with some toddlers who are testing limits, you can imagine how hard it is for us to achieve that when we're working with very young children. In co-regulation, we're focused on the adults for a little bit today because, well, you get a sideways graphic here, because the adults form that secure base. And if you look at this graphic, which is from Circle Security, and I recommend you check out their information online as well, it shows that we're the secure base that the children use as they explore the world. And for very young children, exploration is the same thing as learning. At the Circle Security website, they have some pictures and videos of parents talking about how this approach has helped them. In the last part, under the safe haven, it has some advice for the adults from the child's point of view. Protect me, comfort me, delight in me, and organize my feelings. This whole graphic is about co-regulation and self-regulation, and the idea of helping children to organize their feelings is really important. One of our roles is to help children learn about emotions and to help parents learn to recognize and teach their children about emotions. That gives children the language to communicate how they feel, which lets us know what they need. The other thing under the Circle of Security is where it says, always be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. And I think that that's a wonderful motto that we can all take with us in our work with children. We are the ones who are setting the tone. We are the ones who set the tone of kindness in a room, in a program, in a home visit, wherever you find yourself as a professional with very young children. So how do we get to the place where we're co-regulating with infants and toddlers? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to look at what do the adults need? One of the parts of this that people seem to forget is that the adults are humans too. We need to take care of our teachers and other professionals who work with children so they can be good at their jobs. And let me show you what I mean by that. When we think about children having positive experiences and having adults help children feel supported, we need to support the adults as well, because remember, co-regulation comes first, and to co-regulate, we really need regulated adults. So you can see in this graphic that awareness and support of professionals will lead to responsive professionals, which will lead to positive experiences for both the adults and the children, and lead to children having supported experiences. We know that this is even more important for children who are exposed to other adverse situations in their lives. Teachers care for nearly 11 million children younger than the age of 5, and children spend an average of 36 hours per week in child care. So the people that are working with children in child care and in other settings are having a huge impact on their lives. As professionals, we can be the ones who make a difference for those children who are struggling. By providing warm and responsive caregiving, like Mike in this picture does every day, we help children become emotionally ready for life. And you'll notice that in this picture, Mike is allowing his friend in the white shirt to sit a little bit farther back because she's a little wary of this activity. So he's reading her cues, and when and if she decides she wants to participate, she'll be able to join the experience. So here's another chance for us to have a dialogue. What do you think are some of the characteristics of responsive caregiving? Type your response in as we look at this picture of a teacher and a child who are having one of those moments where they're really connecting with each other quite well. How would you describe a responsive caregiving environment? Type your response in the questions section. All right. Comforting children. Modeling some good calming strategies. offering affection, encouraging friendly relationships with other children. So these are all some of the characteristics of a responsive caregiving environment. And if you think for yourself as an adult about the kinds of environments that you like to spend time in, a lot of those might be responsive environments where people know who you are, where they take the time to find out what you like, what you're interested in, and then you feel more comfortable and more safe in those environments and able to bring your full self to the experience. Okay. So here's another graphic that shows you a little bit about what we're talking about when it comes to teacher mental health and how important teacher mental health is because of the stress responses that we see. So we all come with that nice big luggage filled with our own baggage as we're caring for and holding the hands of these little ones. And if a stressor happens, represented by the fire there, if a stressor happens, we can take one of two paths. The first path is to go into the top 1, 2, 3 of that menu. One part of it is to perseverate, which means to think the same thoughts over and over and over again. So for example, you might be thinking, I just know that the transition to snack time is going to be hard. Or if you're a home visitor, you might be thinking, oh, I just know that when I get to the house, the parent is going to ask me again if their child has autism. And so you kind of have the same thoughts going through your mind over and over and over again. And then you start to think about blaming, maybe blaming other teachers, maybe blaming the director, maybe blaming the entire early intervention system. And you become very reactive in that moment. What we want for teachers to be able to do to co-regulate is to take a pause and go to the 4, 5, and 6 on that menu, which is to be able to breathe, which is to be able to be loving towards the children, to have genuine smiles, and in fact be quite responsive to the needs. But we have to pay attention to the teacher mental health in order to do that. And so I would encourage you to think about some of the calming strategies that you might use in your life. I'm sure that you have some that you use and you've learned from other places. And you can type your ideas into the question box if you have some that you'd particularly like to share some strategies you use in a stressful moment. But here are some of the strategies that we've been working with our students as we try to help them find ways to calm themselves in the moment. One is to feel your body up against the chair or the floor. Another is to identify 5 different colors in the environment. Another is to walk and count backwards if you have the opportunity to do that. And one of the ones that we often tell people to do is to breathe. And when you think about that, you have to kind of be calm already to breathe. You have to be able to still yourself enough to be able to breathe. So what are some of the other ones that you use in the moment for calming yourself? And one of the ways I like to think about this is that we have ways that we calm ourselves that are some of these kind of calming strategies, but we also have ways that we calm ourselves that we do actually with the children. So for example, reading a story to children might be really calming for some of you. Getting out a sensory material for those of you who are really like that feeling of paint or Play-Doh or clay or goop. Singing a song with the children, because we know that music has an organizing effect on the brain. And another one can be just thinking about a happy time or place in your life. So think about some of the ways that you calm yourself down in the moment and some strategies that you use, because those are going to be really important as you deal with those stressors that are coming up in the moment, and as we're trying to be that co-regulator with those very young children. So one of the things that we know is that children need to be understood in the context of their relationships, with which Dr. Alicia Lieberman reminds us of. So, okay, now if we have a calm adult, let's think about the child. We need to think about who children are, starting with their relationships. So who are those children? How are they relating to their families? How are they relating to the people in the child care program or the home visitor, or those of you who work in a clinical setting? How are they relating to the people around them? And those are really important questions for us to know. So when we think about the social, emotional, developmental milestones, these are some of the developmental concepts that we think about, and I'll explain each one of them because they're in their kind of jargony language on the slide to be able to make them fit. But Dr. Leslie Koplow, who runs the Center for Emotionally Responsive Practice at Bank Street College, talks about these. And she says that attunement is one of the first ones, when a child and an adult are able to connect and begin to understand each other. Attachment, which you're probably more familiar with, is when a child feels emotionally connected to the adult and the adult is connected to the child. Differentiation is when the child begins to realize that she's a separate person. People permanence, you might be familiar with object permanence, but even John Piaget, who came up with the idea of object permanence, said people permanence came first. It's when the child knows that people don't just disappear, they come back again. Having a psychological home base is the idea that we saw in the circle of security slide. Not only can you crawl back to your important adult, you know in your heart and mind that they're there for you. Early symbolic play is when children begin to pretend and they're able to work out their feelings through play. Separation issues happen again and again during development as children try to understand what it means to be an individual and to be connected to another person. And when you think about this, we all do this for the rest of our lives as we, for example, leave our parents' house and try to maintain a relationship with them, as we send our own children off to school. We're always learning how to be our separate self and be in relationships with others. And autonomy, a sense of independence and knowing that you're a separate person, is the last one that we'll include on this slide. These milestones are important to know because we need to figure out where that child is in their ability to build relationships. For example, you may have a child who's turning 3, but may still be working on people permanence. So then your job would be to help him know that people come back. And some of the ways we might do that is by having family pictures around the room, or having a comfort object for that child. One of the things that we have found really helpful is that we have teddy bears for each of the children in the infant, toddler, and preschool rooms at the Family Center at my college, and the children are able to access them whenever they want. And it helps them to have a connection with a comfort object. And if a child is having a difficult time with separation, for example, we'll often have one of the parents put their perfume or cologne on the bear so that they can smell their favorite people even when they're not there. So finding out where the child is, and much of our work as teachers and professionals who work with very young children, much of our work is really solving puzzles. as we solve different puzzles about individual children, about a group of children, about our coworkers and how our coworkers are working with children, we're always thinking about, where is this child? How can I meet that child where they are? How can I meet that parent where they are? How can I design an environment or a curriculum that really works for this group of children? And so a lot of it is solving these puzzles, and where the child is in these socio-emotional developmental milestones is a big piece of that puzzle. So we think about, where is that child, and so what kind of support do we need to give them? Because even if the child is at an age where you would expect them to be moving towards autonomy, they may be, for example, at early level symbolic play, or still really trying to find those close and rewarding connections with other people. So what impacts a baby's or toddler's ability to self-regulate? Well, it can be a lot of things. One of the things that often people think about when they're thinking about self-regulation is the child's temperament. And here Dr. Schenker has another way of looking at things. Sometimes we mean difficult, or we say the child is difficult or is having a difficult time, but sometimes it's a stress time. And what we mean by a stress time is sometimes they are having a hard time, either internally or externally, finding a way to figure out how to be in this space. So look at this little one on the left in the red shirt. He is not liking this clay experience, but the child on the right is diving right in. Do we think of one response as a difficult child, or do we see the child's stress and try to figure out what is happening? Is this a little one who doesn't like messy things? Is he in the middle of potty training, so he's worried about mess and it's on his mind? Is he worried about the new adult in the room with the camera who's videotaping him? Something is happening for a little red shirt guy, and we need to understand what that is so we can support his exploration and play. So here are some of the biological factors. Sometimes they make it hard for children to regulate. Maybe a child isn't sleeping enough. Maybe they're having trouble with eating. Maybe it's a health issue. One child I recently heard about had such itchy skin that he looked like he couldn't concentrate. He ran around a lot, and he was really irritable. And if you think about it, having really itchy skin would make all of us feel pretty irritable, and it would make it very hard to regulate. And then some children have neurological states that make it hard for them to regulate. Could be the way the child's brain was wired from birth, or it could be as a result of a trauma. And I don't mean a physical trauma, I mean a trauma that happened in the child's life. For example, the loss of a loved one, or abuse or neglect. So sometimes those cause neurological responses to self-regulation and impact the child's ability to self-regulate. So here are some of the questions we can ask ourselves as we solve the puzzle about social and emotional factors. How does the child modify their responses? How well does the child co-regulate? What's going on in the child's life? And what's going on in the adults' lives as well? Because going back to the beginning of our webinar, we talked a lot about what the adult brings and how the adult can get themselves into a calm and regulated state. If the child has one way of responding to a variety of situations, for example, if the child swipes at children when they come near, we might want to work on establishing some new responses. For example, one of the toddler programs that I find myself in on a regular basis as I supervise a student teacher has a little girl who her way of interacting with other children is to either run up to them and push them. She's just about turning 2. She either runs up and pushes them, or she will grab something out of their hand. So we need to think about how can she learn to modify her responses? How can she learn to come up with some different strategies that are more pro-social? Is the child co-regulating so that we can use our relationship as a way to help the child regulate, or are we still working on establishing a relationship? I remember having a 2-year-old as a toddler teacher. I had a 2-year-old in my room, and she had a hard time establishing relationships with the adults and had some really some behavior that was really aggressive towards the other children. And we found that as soon as she felt like she had somebody in the room that she could depend on, who she felt really connected to, that a lot of that behavior suddenly started to go away, and she started to be able to hear the other strategies we were suggesting for her as ways to have positive interactions with the other children, or meaningful interactions with the other children. When we're thinking about what's going on in the child's life, we also need to consider if there have been many major changes. For example, has there been the birth of a sibling? Did the child move? Is there a loss of an important adult? And when we think of important adults, that includes the people who are working with the children in our programs. So when we think about how a child can be impacted by the loss of an adult, sometimes in our programs we have the teachers and teacher assistants that are coming and going, or therapists that are coming and going, and that's going to have an impact on some of the children. And so that may be the reason that we're seeing some of the behavior that's having them have a harder time self-regulating. And those and other factors might be impacting the adults as well. What's going on in the adults' lives? Are they having struggles, financial struggles? Are they having struggles that are relationship struggles? Often parents will tell professionals who work with young children that they're really worried about telling the truth about their lives to the people who work with their children, because they're worried that their child will be judged, or they're worried that their child won't be treated well if the professionals find out. So sometimes we have to think about our relationships with those adults and establishing the same kinds of relationships with adults as we're trying to have with very young children as well, so that the adults feel comfortable telling us what's going on in their lives, which then will give us some much better information about how we can help the children. Another thing we need to think about in terms of the child factors are some cognitive factors. This one might be hard for us to figure out and assess, but it's critical for us to know where the child is in terms of her ability to think and problem solve, so we know where to start with regulation. For example, you might have a child who is very, very bright and has some good listening skills, and seems to get things that have to do with thinking, and yet you're seeing that when it comes time to self-regulate, that the child's having a lot of trouble. Well, so sometimes we think, well, he's smart enough to understand us, but that thinking ability doesn't necessarily translate to the social and emotional. So we have to go back and look at some of those social and emotional factors and relationship factors, so that we can find out where that child is. And then if you have a child who's bright, sometimes that's very helpful to use in your ability to help them learn those self-regulation skills. I worked with a 2-year-old in a therapeutic preschool setting, turning 3, and he was very bright, and he loved to laugh about a lot of different things, but he had the worst time when it came to sharing materials with other children. And when he was asked to share materials with other children, it often didn't end well for the other child. And so we had this game that we used to play with him. He loved to jump on, we had a little trampoline in the room, and he loved to jump on the trampoline. And since we couldn't practice this with other children, we practiced this with a doll. And so we practiced turn taking with this doll. And so he would jump on the trampoline, and then it would be the doll's turn. And then when he was jumping on the trampoline, often we would say, you know, from the doll's perspective, as if the doll was talking, we would say, I want to turn, I want to turn, it's my turn, get off the trampoline. And he would, and he laughed, and he said, hey, that sounds just like me. So we used his cognitive abilities to really help him realize that the social and emotional way he was dealing with other children was causing him some trouble. And in this setting, he was able to really understand that and to kind of laugh at himself. But if a child is not cognitively able to understand the things you're telling him or her, then you're going to have to go back and meet that child at their cognitive level. And while it is hard to figure out where children are on their cognitive level, it becomes really, really important. Often, trauma such as abuse or accidents can contribute to a child seeming like she or he is having trouble self-regulating. For example, sometimes when you meet a child and they look like they have a hard time attending to and paying attention to what's going on, they have a hard time sitting still, they like to run around a lot, and you think, oh, this is definitely a self-regulation issue. Well, I remember one little, he was about 14 months old when I met him, and he was really having a hard time. He couldn't focus very easily, and he had a very hard time sitting down and paying attention, and he had only a few play skills, in part because of that. Well, it turned out, in talking to the parent, I found out that as a very young infant, he had to have some open heart surgery. And so his body had suffered this real trauma. And so he was trying to, his body was still coming back online. So in a lot of ways, his body was still in a very infant state where he was trying to figure out, you know, just how to be in the world. And to try to get his body to calm down enough. And so when we realized that that's what was happening, we stopped dealing with him as if he was a 14-month-old or 15-month-old, and we started to think about how would you help a baby who was just learning about their body self-regulate. So sometimes those trauma-related behaviors can seem like those attention deficits, aggression, and inability to make a connection with adults. And so they seem like they're a self-regulation issue, but we really have to deal with what happened to the child and what happened in the child's life, and providing a way to help that child feel safe in our environment. So when we're thinking about trauma and self-regulation, the question we like to ask ourselves is it misbehavior or is it stressed behavior? So I'm going to pause here for a second, because this is a good place to answer one of the questions that come up, that have come up in the question box, which is, what do you do when a child cries and screams and has short tantrums at any time of the day at an unexpected time on a daily basis? So let's think about that. So we have this child who's crying and screaming. It's a little bit hard because we don't know how old that child is, and that's one of the first things we have to think about, right, when we're thinking about some of the behavior that we're seeing. So we're looking at a child, and if you have a child who's crying and screaming and having tantrums who's 15 months old, that's going to be very different than that child who's screaming and throwing tantrums at maybe 25 months old or getting close to 3. So one of the first things we'd need to know is how old that child is. And using this way of thinking about children and way of thinking about how we're going to find out. We're going to look at all the different factors. So we're not going to answer the question of what do you do. We're going to answer the question in terms of what do you need to know? What do you need to know in order to help this child who is clearly frustrated or maybe angry? And how are we going to help that child? And so we're going to think about all the things we talked about before. First, we're going to think about ourselves and maybe what's happening with us. Are we calm? Are we being regulated with that child? Or are we just waiting for that child to have the next tantrum and getting more and more anxious about it? And then we're going to look at that child and say, okay, is there anything going on in that child's life that we need to know about that may be causing some disruptions, that may be making it harder for that child? Where is that child in terms of their relationship with us? Does that child have a really close relationship with us? Or do we need to do some work there? Do we need to have one of the people who work with that child be the primary person that forms a real good relationship with them so that child has somebody to trust in that environment? How much can that child understand? Where are they cognitively, and where are their thinking skills, and how much can they understand of what's going on? And so we're really going to look at that child and try to figure out for ourselves and for them what are some of those factors. And then we'll go into, a little bit later, we'll go into some of the ways that we think about that and some of the ways that we can maybe make some changes in the environment or the routine that might be helpful. But I think the first place to start is not thinking about it as in terms of what do you do, but thinking about it in terms of what do you need to know in order to help this child. Okay. So let's dive into some case studies and some ideas about children and how we can help children through our understanding of what's going on with them. So here's Mason. Mason's 18 months old. These are all true stories from my experience as a teacher and early interventionist. So Mason's 18 months old, and every time he comes into the child care room each morning, he knocks everything off the shelves. Mostly there's a lot of little animals lined up on the shelves, or maybe some puzzles out on the shelves, and he knocks everything off the shelves onto the floor. So what are the questions that we need to ask ourselves to help Mason be able to regulate? Well, we want to think about when and where this behavior occurs. Well, we know when. It occurs every single morning when Mason enters the environment. Where does it occur? It occurs at the first shelf that he comes into in the room. Here's a good, important question. Who is present? Well, in this case, it's the teacher, and sometimes the teacher assistant, and also one of the parents is usually about 30 seconds behind Mason. So what's happening in the space? Well, Mason's the first one to arrive usually. So the teachers are often setting up the space, and they're often trying to get ready for the day. Then we think about, are there any stressors at home? In this case, there weren't stressors at home. What are the child factors? It seemed like Mason had a really good relationship with at least one and probably two or more of the adults in the room. Mason was a child who was kind of easygoing besides this morning episode every day. He was cognitively, he was at an appropriate age level. He was really, the rest of the day, able to follow the routine. So, so the child factors didn't really give us that much information. What was our response? Well, our response was to be really exasperated every single time this happened, unfortunately. And so, so we would come in, we would be getting everything set up, and everything would get knocked off the table or the top of the shelf, and we would have to kind of start all over again quickly before the other children came in. So those were the questions that we asked ourselves. And then we thought about what might our plan be. So what might the plan be? Were there any changes we could make to the schedule or the environment? Well, we had to have the children come in the morning, so we couldn't really make changes to that schedule, and his family needed him to be one of the first people there because they had to get to their jobs. So what could we change in terms of the environment? Well, we thought about, do we take the things off the top of the shelves? Do we maybe put things out before he got to the shelves that might be interesting? What are Mason's strengths and interests? Well, Mason was a child who really liked to engage in active experiences, but he also was a child who really loved to sit and read. His developmental level at 18 months was that we were really going to have to be the ones who solved this. He was not going to be able to use his cognitive skills so much to be able to listen and reason about this. And then we thought about what were some of the strategies that had been effective before with him. And because we really hadn't had issues with him very much before, we didn't really know how many strategies that we had that were good for Mason. So then we thought about some of the adult factors. Why did we find this behavior so challenging? Sometimes adults don't like their stuff messed up. Sometimes you want to be able to just get set in the beginning of the day, and you don't want to have to reset everything once you've set it. So it was very challenging for the adults. What was our stress level? Well, our stress level was pretty high because we were coming in and maybe coming in a little bit late or coming in and not being able to get everything set up the way we would want to do. And then we thought about what we could do before Mason arrived to calm ourselves. So let's take a second and have people type some ideas about what they think might be helpful to Mason in this situation. And then I'll read some of those ideas, and then I'll tell you what we actually ended up doing to help Mason. Okay. So what are some of the things that people are hearing in that case study that give them some information about what might be helpful to Mason, who is 18 months and has this shelf-clearing behavior that he's engaging in? And give people a few seconds to type their responses. They come up. Let's see as they come up. While we're doing that, I can read some of the responses that I got to one of the other questions, which was how do you create a responsive environment? And it actually might provide some help with this one. A warm and welcoming teacher who's always at the child's level is helpful to a warm and responsive caregiving environment. Okay. So here's some of the thoughts that people have. Another good thought that people had about the warm and responsive environment that's actually very helpful in this situation is you breathe and you know not to take anything that happens in the classroom personally. And that's always helpful for us, right? As we're trying to figure out how to help children, we have to not take things personally and not think that this is being done to us, rather than this is just a behavior that the child is engaging in because they are trying to tell us something, because behavior has meaning. So here's some of the things that people are thinking. Oh, and we found out that the child is 2 years old. So that's really helpful. Thank you, Yvette, for that information. So some of the things people are saying are, maybe we can try tuning into the child's cues. That the teachers are preoccupied by getting their day ready. Somebody said that perhaps you can try a different room, which is interesting. Which is an interesting idea. I'm guessing they mean having the child enter into a different room, or maybe they mean having the child move to a different room. But one of the things that we really want for children, we really want them to be able to have meaningful relationships with the adults, and we know that because we need the adults to co-regulate. We wouldn't want to take him away from his familiar adults, because that's what's going to be the solution here, is finding a way for Mason and his familiar adults to work this out together. Okay, so a lot of the answers that you're coming up with are exactly what ended up happening. We realized that when Mason walked in, he really needed to be noticed. And we all need to be noticed in some ways, but for Mason, he really wanted us to acknowledge him and to notice. And the fact that we were preoccupied and he was coming into our space, he couldn't deal with that. That was too much for him, and as in his 18-month-old way of being. And so, it's like if you think about it, when you walk into a place and nobody greets you, how does that feel to you? Right? You feel like it's kind of rude, and you may have a hard time feeling good about that space. And so that's really one of the things that was happening with Mason. And he didn't have another way to tell us that. He didn't, he wasn't able to say, hey, Margie, this is really not working for me. Can you try another strategy? Because he was 18 months old. So he was telling us with his behavior that he really needed some help. And so he was able to come up with this way of getting our attention, and he was getting our attention in that way. So we used some of his strengths and some of his interests in order to turn this situation around. So when he came in, it was like, if any of you are familiar with, this may be dating myself, but if any of you are familiar with the show Cheers from a long time ago, when somebody entered the bar, everybody would yell their name. And so when Mason would enter the room, we would all say, Mason, you're here today. We've been waiting for you. And really give him a lot of affect to let him know that we were there and that we were there for him. And then often one of us would say, would you like to walk with me to get the juice for the morning, or would you like to sit and read a book with somebody? And give him a couple of different choices that were around his own interests, so that he could have that opportunity to have that moment with us and have that real moment of connectedness. And sure enough, the behavior went away pretty quickly. Okay. So let's go on to another case study. This is one that happened when I was a early intervention home visitor. Had a child who was 26 months old, and she'd been diagnosed with autism. when I arrived at her house for the first visit, she ran around the table for the first 20 minutes of the visit. Those of you who have worked with children who have autism know that this is not an uncommon situation. So again, we were thinking about when and where the behavior occurred, who was present, what's happening in the space, were there any stressors at home, and what were the child factors. And so in talking to the family, we found out that this was pretty much how Alexa spent her whole day, was running around that dining room table. And every once in a while she got tired and she would sit down and do something else, but for the most part that was her way of being in the world. So we looked to see, so who is present, and it certainly was happening when the family was there. It was also happening when the early interventionists came in. What was happening in the space. There were a lot of things that Alexa could have chosen in the space. There were plenty of toys for her, but that was her primary activity. There weren't any particular stressors at home, but this was a child who clearly neurologically was having a hard time negotiating the world. And so her way of self-regulating, and it really was a way of self-regulating, was to run around the dining room table. And so we thought, we thought very hard about this, and one of the things that we know in dealing with any kind of behaviors, challenging or not, is that it's important to not take away a behavior that has a function to it, like running around the table, which was somehow calming her or helping her organize herself. So we decided not to take that behavior away, and instead we decided to see if we could replace it with some other things. So so this was a child who had some neurological stuff going on, and we knew that. There were some sensory issues. For example, she had a very hard time with loud noises, and so we had to really think about what was, what we could do and how we could help her, and what we could replace this behavior with. So what are our plans? Were there changes we could make to the schedule or the environment? Well, this was in somebody's home, so we really didn't want to tell them to rearrange their furniture. And again, it was organizing for her, so we didn't want to take that away from her. Her strengths and interests, obviously one of her strengths was being able to run, so she had a lot of stamina. And her interests, she was interested in, besides running, she was also interested in sometimes lining things up, but she was also interested in using art materials. Developmentally, even though she was 26 months, she was developmentally, in a lot of areas of her development, she was functioning much younger than that. So the parents really didn't have any strategies they found to be effective to stop the running, except to take her outside. And we had to think about how can we involve and support the family in this plan. Now, as you can imagine, as an adult, why do you find this behavior challenging? Well, I'm coming in as an early interventionist, and there are goals that have been established, and so I feel like I have to meet those goals, and I'm just meeting the family, so there's a lot of pressure in that way. So I had to think about that, and that's a stress level of having a child who's running around the whole time. But I really had to think about what could I do before I got to her house to calm myself, and so I really had to think about that. What could I do to calm myself? And so I came up with some ways of calming myself before I even got to the house, so that I could come in and be as calm as possible. So let's take another opportunity for people to type in some ideas that they might have. that they might have for ways we can think about this situation and what behaviors we might use to replace the one of running around the room. So I'll give you some time to type and give you some more information about this child. This child was able to talk, but a lot of her talk was what they call scripted. So she repeated phrases that she had heard. And so communication was pretty tricky. She had a really lovely relationship with her family and really loved her parents and had an older sibling who she also loved a lot. And so she had really nice relationships there as well. Let's see. Okay. So what are some of the ideas about people that people have? One of the ideas is to make sure that when she went to school, this was in her home, but when she went to a school or a child care program, that would have to really be paying close attention to safety, and that is always the first concern, right? Making sure that we are able to keep this child safe, because if you think about, and Alexa did end up going to a school-based child care program during the time that I was working with her and her family. And so, yeah, that was one of the major concerns we had was definitely around safety. Making sure that there were always opportunities to engage in arts and crafts, absolutely. And another suggestion is to think about how we can build in some more outdoor play. And that is absolutely some of the things that we definitely did to help Alexa. So we spent when we tried to when we thought about with the family, when we thought about how we might work with Alexa to establish a relationship with me as the interventionist, because she had these lovely relationships with her family. We realized we had to do that in a setting that was appropriate for her. But I had to be really careful because she had a lot of energy. And a colleague of mine tells this wonderful story about how she was, when she first started doing early intervention, she was working with a child who was one of these children who was very active, and her first idea was to get at the child's level, and so she too was jumping around and running around with the child, and she found that wasn't actually a very good strategy, come to think of it, because then there were two people who were acting. Who were very active and who were pretty dysregulated. So she realized that one of the things that she could do was to be calm and to bring a sense of calm. But we had to do it through the experiences that she really enjoyed. And so we did find very active, very physical ways for her to do arts and crafts. So not so much like sitting at a table with some markers, more going outside and painting with water, for example, on the house, or chalk on a very big sidewalk or a driveway. So we found ways that incorporated a lot of activity, but were really able to establish that relationship, because the relationship was the key to then moving forward and having all of us be able to help Alexa develop some self-regulation skills. Because as I said, we really couldn't have her establish we couldn't take that away from her because she was using it to organize. So we came up with some other strategies for organizing and taught Alexa some games that she really enjoyed, that helped her when she was feeling that kind of need to organize. So that was some of the things that happened. If anybody has a particular question or situation, feel free to type that into the question box as well, and we can look at some of those before we end. So in thinking about this, there could be some other sources of stress for children and families. For example, there could be some stress within the extended family. There could be neighborhood stress. They could live in a neighborhood that doesn't feel safe for them, and so there's just the stress of coming home every day where you don't feel safe in your own neighborhood. Financial issues can cause stress for families, which then trickles down to children. We're finding that children who have parents who there was a study done recently that showed that children who have parents that fight with each other, even if it's when the child is sleeping, the child is actually aware of it and using a lot of their brain to be vigilant, to pay attention in case that happens, because they're really trying to pay attention to that, so that they can make sure that the environment is safe, because that's what our brains do. Our brains are designed to try to pick up on any danger. And so we often spend a lot of time with children who are traumatized, who've experienced a lot of stress. We try to help them learn ways to tell their brain that it's okay and that they're really fine. And another thing that we can't, as a source of stress that we can't overlook, is that that there is a lot of institutionalized racism that families face, and it has to do with opportunities. It has to do with, just the pressure of feeling unsafe. And I know that I was talking to a parent the other day who was telling me how hard it was to have a child, have a young African American male child who had special needs, and his needs are around communication, and how worried that made her, because she knew that he would be more of a target and would not be able to explain himself in situations. So even at the age of, he's 2, but even at the age of 2, this parent is already really worried about this as well. So there are a lot of other sources of stress that we need to pay attention to. We also need to think about, what's the self-regulation of the family? So what does that look like? Is the family regulated, or do we need to work with the family and help them find some calming strategies that they know from their own culture and their own experiences that they can use? What's the self-regulation of the child care infant-toddler room, if you're there? So in the infant-toddler room, is that a regulated place? Is there a lot of noise? Is it very busy? Are there a lot of things going on? Sometimes I walk in and there are so many things to look at. I think that I'm probably going to get dysregulated by the end of the time there, because there's just so much going on. Are there calm areas? Somebody recommended having a calming corner with pillows and things that a child could really focus on. So thinking about your own environments, and are they regulated? Are they places where children can be calm? Is the center a place where children can be calm? Is the center a place where people are working together and people are supporting each other? And that's really helpful to regulating the center. Is the community a community that is calm, or is it a community that has a lot of stress in it? I think there are a lot of there's a lot of stress just in the environment in general, but some communities have more stress than others do, especially in low-income communities. Often in low-income communities, there's issues of safety and a lot of stress. So, and just the society in general, I think is really helpful to think about how much stress is there in society, how much stress is there on parents. We had a family come in the other day to one of my courses with their 2-month-old, and but they have a new 2-month-old, and they came in to visit us, and it was so fascinating that this woman is a graduate of our programs who has studied infant development. Said she has a hard time tuning out all of the things that people tell her about what she's supposed to be doing with her child. So there's a lot of stress out there for parents. Parents are often judged and told by a lot of people what they should be doing. So, so we need to think about that in our work as well. Okay, so here are some of our take-home messages for today. First one is that calm adults lead to calm children. Another one is that co-regulation comes before self-regulation. Another is that stress behavior is not necessarily misbehavior. It may be stressed, and we can find the source of the stress and then help that behavior turn into something else. Another one is to find the source of the dysregulation, because we don't want to use the same strategy for all sources because it won't work. So if we find out why a child is dysregulated, if we consider all the factors and figure that out, we'll come up with a solution that meets the source of the dysregulations. And that all of these strategies should be a combination of investigation and problem solving, thinking about this as a puzzle, and thinking about the puzzle and how we can solve that puzzle as we go on. So those are some of the take-home messages. I'm trying to see some of the ideas that people have. If you want to type in some thoughts about what was important or useful information for you in this session, that would be helpful as well. Looking through some of the comments. All right. So here are some of the things that people are saying about some of the things that they found useful today, or some of the different strategies, some of the ways of thinking about children, thinking about children in a problem-solving way. Seems like people have some very good instincts around the children, and have some very good instincts around how to set up a calming environment as well. So people are sharing some ideas about using things like calming music. Somebody else said that the factors for each of the case studies are valuable, and thinking about how the children might be feeling is really helpful. Somebody else said that thinking about the difference between misbehavior and stressors are helpful. And now we're getting a little question about a comment about separating why the children might be feeling a certain way and looking at the environment around them. Yeah, one of the things we didn't really get into as much is the idea that that sometimes we have to change our environments because our environments are overstimulating, our environments are contributing to. I know that oftentimes when I walk into childcare programs, there's music playing and the music stays on the whole time. For some children, that might be too much. And so thinking about the environment and how to set up a calming environment. Somebody else is saying one of the things that was helpful to her was to think about not removing a behavior but replacing a behavior, that was something that she found really helpful. Somebody was saying that sometimes she dims the light in her room just to create a more calming environment. Somebody else says that she agrees with the fact that the emotional state of the adults directly impacts children. Oftentimes the adults don't realize. They just expect the children to behave in a certain way, and they don't realize that they're affecting the behavior as well. And sometimes and she's pointing out that sometimes the model that we set is actually contradictory to the model that we want children. So if we get kind of upset and loud, then that's going to lead to children who get upset and loud as well. Okay. A lot of people are saying the difference between stress behavior and misbehavior is something that is really interesting to them. Okay, I think they were going to do one more, and then I'm trying to find, there's somebody who had a question, but it's kind of lost to me now, unfortunately. Oh, here it is. A child that has a hard time adapting, and the parents are not doing the best job in working with the teacher to help the child adjust. You know, we often have this in childcare and school settings where we feel like the parents might be able to do more to help the child adjust, but really the parents operate in their home primarily. They don't have the kind of training that we have in our environment. So often we end up very frustrated because we're trying to get the parents to do something to help us help the child, but they don't really have the resources to do that. And so we really have to take that on ourselves and figure out a way to help that child in our environment. And not depend on the families, because as we know, not many people have the kind of training that we have in working with children. So the last comment I'll read is about how attunement is essential throughout the life between the parent and the child and the teacher and the student, and that's so true that a big part of what we do as educators is we find ways to establish those relationships, which then become very helpful to the children as they're trying to negotiate the world. Okay, so here are some references that we talked about before. The Center on the Social Emotional Foundations of Early Learning is one of the places that some of those questions that we ask ourselves during the case studies came from. And they are at Vanderbilt, and they have some wonderful resources about behavior and social emotional development that you can look up on their site. All their resources are free, and you can just download them. Leslie Koplow at the Center for Emotionally Responsive Practice at Bank Street College. Alicia Lieberman is a wonderful resource on the social emotional development of toddlers, especially. And we talked about the Circle of Security folks, and they have their own website at circleofsecurity.com. And then Stuart Shanker, who's doing a lot of work on self-regulation, around self-regulation versus self-control. And he has a blog on Psychology Today that talks about self-regulation specifically. So at this time, the organizers will upload the certificate of attendance, and you'll be able to find that in your, you have a tab on your GoToWebinar menu, and it will say handouts, and that will be uploaded, and you can just click on it and download it. And if you can't do that, and that all sounds really complicated, don't worry about it. You'll get one by email. You'll get a certificate by email next week. And again, to remind you that this is a part of the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health, which is a clinical consultation and professional development and research center concerned with the optimal development of infants, children, and families with and without developmental disabilities. And they have a variety of services, everything from graduate programs. They do workshops and conferences that I would encourage you to learn about and take advantage of. Okay, so thank you all for joining us today and for participating in this seminar, and your questions and your comments were really wonderful and made this so much more dynamic, and was glad to have the opportunity to have a little bit of back and forth with you as well. So thank you so much for being here and for participating. You can get in touch with the center, and they know how to get in touch with me if you have any more questions. I'd be happy to be in touch with you if you have any specific questions about your program or your site that you think I might be able to offer you some guidance on. But remember that our job is to solve the puzzle, and we are problem solvers as teachers and people who work with very young children. And so think about all of the pieces of the puzzle to help each child and each family. Thank you so much for joining us today.